Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. In this episode, we're going to be looking at third-party documents. We've already covered some internal documents, so you might want to check that out in a previous episode. But with us today, we have Mr. Ronnie Wong. Thank you for joining us today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me on the show as we continue on to take a look at more CompTIA Project Plus, and specifically talking about the idea of identifying third-party documents. Now, just like Cherokee said in a previous episode, usually we take a look at those documents much more in depth. In this one, we just need to make sure that we understand that when we're dealing with third parties, okay, that not everything always follows underneath our control of things, and so you have to actually have a lot more official documentation on hand when you deal with vendors. And it's not because they're shifty, I don't want to say that, but it's because they do tend to work for a different company, and that means that they're probably not under your administrative control, and their time management's a bit different. And so you tend to have to actually begin and to take a look at what you can do if you need to establish a relationship with them. How do you make that binding so that they can work within your project the way that you want them to work?
Well, sure. I mean, you have to think about it. You have control over who you hire within your organization, but you have to trust the practices, the third parties, corporate policies, things like that, that you do have to relinquish some of that control.
You really have to, because of that very fact that what you have, of course, now is essentially two companies that are deciding that they are going to work together. So in project management, that really comes in, well, two stages, right? The first stage, especially when you're working with a vendor or a third-party supplier of some sort, whether they're going to be working on your project in terms of services or offering products that you're going to end up using, is that you need to now begin to submit and to actually advertise what we call different types of requests for our project. So normally when we begin with this particular idea, let's say that what we have here in terms of a scenario is that we are ready to now start planning our project out, and we realize that we need to be able to get some vendor information because there's a product that we really need. But because we're underneath the constraint of our cost for our budget and the time and the requirements, we also need to make sure that whoever we deal with has the ability to supply what we need in terms of the order and the amount, okay, has the ability to deliver it, okay, in the way that we actually need it and when we need it, okay, and is willing to work with us as well for whatever we agree to pay them. So normally where this begins is what is called a request for information. Now when we start talking about the idea of a request for information, it doesn't normally start off with, let's say Cherokee's our project manager, where what Cherokee says, all right, is we need a bunch of information, okay? Now you do, but what actually normally happens is that you figure out, okay, that you're going to need to work with so many different suppliers, and you know that there's maybe a glut of those people that can give you whatever pieces or products that you're looking for, and now what you're really looking for again is the best bang for the buck, right? I'm not saying the cheapest, but I'm saying what gives you the most that you can actually have, and the best quality, the best quantity, whatever it is, for the amount of money that you're willing to put out there. And that idea of the request for information, okay, gives every potential supplier, okay, the ability to now register and say that they're expressing an interest to become what we call the preferred supplier for our project at this point. So you might go ahead then and actually advertise that, okay, is that you put it in trade papers, you put it in, where people tend to go and look for these types of jobs, and you say, hey, open for bidding. But before you can do that, right, we need to make sure that you actually can meet those requirements. And if you're interested in working with us, let's go ahead and tell you what you actually have to be able to do, okay? So at this particular point, when you do this request for information, that you need to make sure that you actually get all the information you need from the supplier itself to determine, one, whether or not they're actually eligible to become your supplier. So this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, right? Because let's say, and I'm going to put Cherokee in my scenario here and pick on her a bit here. Let's say that Cherokee goes, I know the perfect supplier for this it's my cousin over here, and now all of a sudden it's a little bit nepotistic is what we have, right? My cousin, of course, can supply this information. That's fine, okay? But we might find out something that at this point, even though her cousin might be able to supply it, what if he really can't? What if he really cannot actually afford to essentially bank all of his particular supply on this on one customer, okay? What if we don't need that particular supply until about 4 months later? He says, no, what I really need is something that can take this off my hands right now. Well, that's why we actually do the request for information. We put in the time requirement we're looking at. We're putting in the amount of if you're actually interested in doing this, you're trying to get and trying to make sure that they can meet the demand that you have on your project, okay? So there's a lot of information here, okay, when you start to do this. The other part of this request, of course, is really where we start seeing the idea here of describing the process in which somebody goes through. Is your company willing to jump through the hoop that I set up, okay, to be able to say you're qualified to do this as well?
And something that's kind of interesting, Ronnie, like Don mentioned today, I don't know if you guys know that currently Wes and Don are out in Australia. They've been out and about in New Zealand. But they had to actually get a special permission in order to solicit or contact particular vendors. So you might want to be cognizant of different, regulations abroad.
Yeah,
something to think about.
Yeah, abroad or even in your particular county too. So you got to realize that there may be other things that are in play here. But overall, though, you actually do advertise that out there. Here are the basic requirements, and if you meet these particular requirements here and you're interested, give us the information that we're looking for, and that will put you onto a list in which will give us that ability to know whether or not we should even contact you for what is to happen. So normally in this point, right, that's really part of that entire process of getting at least the basic information, showing that you know what the time frame is and you're actually allowing them to do that for the actual selection. In other words, you're not holding them at bay until forever. You're telling them that a selection will be made by this particular date. So making sure that that's good, and also making sure that they understand what it is that they're signing up for when they do it in terms of the delivery of that product too. So it might be something that has to be custom made, and you might find a shop that's willing to do it. But when you say, can you give me 10,000 of these in 4 weeks, okay, from the time I actually get you the actual information, and they might go, I maybe be able to do half of that. And that might not be sufficient enough. So hopefully that means they won't turn in a bid for it.
And I like how you attached a time to that particular request, that proposal, because if you leave it open-ended like that, that just kind of really, it leaves it open-ended, and you could come to some sort of conflict if the customer, towards the end of that project, if they're not satisfied, you have no kind of way of saying, look, this is when we're supposed to be completed, this is what should be the satisfactory requirements for that particular project.
Yeah, there's no doubt that you have to have all those things in consideration in the request for information. Now, once you go through the request for information, you find out that you have 4 or 5 possible vendors that are now ready to possibly become on that list of preferred vendors. You may end up now requesting what we call a proposal. In other words, you start spelling out a little bit about the details of your project at this point, and once you do that, you actually tell them that this is what you want to hear from them. Can you do it? How are you going to do it? And what is your proposal? In other words, what would you need to accomplish this? So you may not let out all the details about what you're willing to spend right now. You can, and that could be a part of the process already, but you actually, again, allow them to actually propose to you what timeline, all the information that they need to make sure that they know exactly what needs to be done, okay? So this way, the provider itself can say to you, yes, I'm interested, here's what I can do in the next 30 days, or here's what I can do, and that way you're weeding it out to possibly isolating. So even among 4 or 5, and everybody thinks I can generally do it, but when you ask them for a proposal, like how are you going to do this, and why should we pick you? Well, that's the idea of the proposal, to let them know what your capabilities are, and that's what you're asking them, is what are their particular capabilities, okay? And that way, you can compare those that are willing to submit the proposal. A lot of times you also end up finding out, even among 4 or 5 providers, once they start getting information like this, some of them are absolutely willing to sit down and actually fill out the paperwork and try and show you what they can really do. You might find out there's a couple of companies that are going, I don't think I can do that. Or you might find out that they're just not willing to do the paperwork to submit to that process.
And my thing is, look, if you don't even have an implied interest and fill out the paperwork, then you're probably not going to be a good candidate for my project.
And that's fair, and it really is, because you're not really promising them anything at this point, right? The only thing you're doing is actually you're requesting what in the information. Are you interested in doing this, and do you meet the eligibility requirements that I'm going to require just for you to show an interest that I might choose to work with you? Then secondly, you're really handing the ball over to their court and saying, all right, here's what I need. Tell me how you can actually do this and whether or not you can really fulfill this particular request that we're doing. So give me your proposal that this can actually happen. Now, once you actually have those proposals in hand, you might choose either two or you might choose one. At that point, you can now request an actual final quote from them. Remember that everything's pretty much negotiable. You can say in your mind during the planning process that, hey, we're not going to spend any more than $10,000 on this. But it might be where at the end of everything, right, you have your two proposals, and all of a sudden you realize something. One submitted $15,000, one submitted $14,500.
And this is where the bidding wars start.
Yep. And so that's why you actually want the idea of quotes here when they do this, okay? And the idea of just bidding is not enough, right? I'm saying that they come in for the lowest bidder. It's always funny, and you always hear the jokes about this on movies, where they talk about, imagine this, it's a $17 billion to put a man on the moon. I don't know how much it actually costs. And it was all gone to the lowest bidder is what it came down to. Somebody that actually built the actual project came down to that idea of the lowest bidder. So in this idea of the request for quote, you're actually going to supply them with a template to say, hey, here's what we're actually willing to go up to in this point here. But you might find out something in your particular way that you limited and said $10,000. That everybody in, at least from your preferred list at this point, they can't even come close to doing it. So then at that point, you may actually have to negotiate, the difference, or you may actually have to kind of go back to your project sponsor and go, here's what we found out. Apparently we were a little bit lowballing the idea of what we actually needed here. Everybody's turning in at least $4,000 above, what we expected to have to pay. And the great thing is, in today's information age, you have a lot of resources, right now, just on you doing like internet searches, on you being able to actually get more information from different places, and even from far away, that might, show you whether or not, everybody's I shouldn't say not being truthful, but whether or not they're actually being comparable, right? Or are they just kind of, saying, oh, I'm going to pad my figure at this point. You got to expect a little bit of that. But overall, that's what you're actually doing, okay? Now, the other part of this request for a quote now, right? We've already talked about information, request for a proposal, and request for quote, is normally before they get to this quote stage, is preceded by what we call an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement.
And yes, and don't be offended if a company asks you to sign that. It's fairly common, so just be aware of that.
Yeah, so Cherokee, since you said that, let's talk about it. It sounds common enough, but what are we really looking at when we talk about a non-disclosure agreement if this was something like this?
Well, Ronnie, let's just say I had a fabulous idea, and this idea, I didn't want it to leak or to be shared out, or maybe I'm dealing with sensitive customer information that had a certain level of privacy that I needed to adhere to. So I would just want to make sure that any kind of contractors or people that I were going into business with would respect that privacy that is implied to my customers or my employees or whomever I'm trying to protect in that situation.
Yeah, the other part of this, and that's great because that's exactly what we're really looking for when it comes down to information we really don't want to get out there, but so that we can actually get honest bidding that goes on from what people really feel like that they can afford to do and what they can't. We don't want somebody coming in and saying, oh, here's how much I actually submitted for this bid in here. And then now it gets around through conversation, right? That now here it is, Cherokee submitted a $14,000 bid, and now it's ended up at Mike's desk. Mike realizes Cherokee's done that, and Mike goes, I don't know what I'm going to do here. I'm going to submit one for, $10,000 or $11,000. And when you start doing that, right, it now actually becomes not, the idea here of submitting an honest bid for an honest day's work, right? It now becomes, ooh, I got the inside knowledge here that I know I can at least undercut Cherokee, and that pushes her out of the process here. And so signing a non-disclosure means when I submit my bid, I don't tell anybody else about it. I just tell them, yeah, we submitted our bid, and you might have a side deal with somebody, but hopefully you don't have that. But at this point, the company is saying what? We don't want you to discuss your bid with any other possible competitor. We want to get all those bids in first, okay? And then we'll choose from among them. And that way, when the bidding's actually done, you either know that you submitted the lowest bid, which might be the only criteria, or your bid was low enough, but you might find out later, it's just that when you actually had your proposal, that proposal didn't go far enough that you actually thought it was going to do. And somebody, went ahead and when they looked at the actual proposal, they're like, man, this is a better proposal than this one, even though this one is actually cheaper. So it gives you that ability to have that honest quote, and that's what you need. But that's really kind of the first step when you start working with third-party vendors, is you get enough information that you need. You're really putting the ball in their court when you're requesting that proposal, okay? And then you're asking them to come back to you with an honest bid for what you need, okay? Now, along with this quote, right, you want to make sure that they understand what they're quoting on. And this is where people get upset the most, and vendors get upset the most, is that they don't understand when you come back and your competitor's jumping up and down because they won the bid, and you're like, well, why didn't mine get selected? What is it that I missed here? And what is it that that guy had, that I didn't have, okay? Well, that means that they believe what? That somehow, Cherokee, if you're the one that's actually delivering the news, that somehow you and your team decided that, hey, we gave Ronnie enough information, but you didn't give me all the information to decide on how much I really, needed to bid on this. So you need to make sure that all the selection criteria for the quote includes things like the functionality of the project or the range of services. You want to make sure you know what the initial price of the offered product or service is going to be. So there's a whole list of total cost of ownership during the lifetime of the actual product itself, cost drivers of what you're actually offering, services, you name it, delivery costs, risks associated, ability to meet the stated requirements. All of these are actually possible.
Yeah, they might have not had the proper licensing for that particular
Yeah,
project.
and that's what it might come down to. And that's great that you mentioned that, because remember what Cherokee said a little bit earlier, is that sometimes we're kind of locked in by the regulation. And they might have had the lowest bid. They might have actually said, we can do all of this here. And then when you said, well, all right, you're listing that you are able to verify that you've got all these regulatory compliance issues done, okay? And all of a sudden you realize they didn't list anything. And then you're kind of going, well, what do we need to do? Well, you do your own investigation, right? You go and you find out about that company. Did they meet all of the eligibility requirements for that? And if they did, it's fine, but now you find out what? They didn't, and that might actually eliminate them from that process as well, even though they had the lowest bid. But you do have to state that stuff so that everybody understands it's fair and it's based off of that. Very important part of the process, or people will always feel cheated.
Yeah. And then, so moving forward, what do we do next? Once we go ahead and let's say we were selected. Okay, we met the requirements, we were the best price, and everything looks honky-dory.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at my screen then for a moment here, and let me make sure I pull up some stuff. So here was this idea of that request for proposal, and this can come in many different forms, right? And so a lot of times, I'm just going to show you the table of contents. So you can tell that this particular form is fairly long, and if you're going like, do I have to make this all up? No, you don't. The great thing is on the internet, there's plenty of places willing to provide you, especially in project management, for free templates that will help you out. So normally there's all of this. When you actually ask them for a proposal, you can actually say, you need to submit the proposal using this template, okay? And that way, nobody judges it based on the very fact that Cherokee turned ours in on very fancy, high-quality, bonded cotton paper, and Ronnie
I probably would too, yeah.
And Ronnie turned his in on, oh, it looks like the back of a Waffle House napkin here. No, don't, I wouldn't do that, but you kind of get the idea, right?
Do you see Breaking Bad, where the attorney was in the bathroom and he wrote a contract on a toilet paper?
Well, there you go. Yeah. Yep. No, I did not see that
Or
one.
maybe it was the spin-off episode.
It could be, yeah. So
Better Call Saul.
Yeah. So, but you actually have all of this information, right? So once all of this is done and you get that request for quotes, that means the second part of actually all the requests that come in, and you're now ready to pull the trigger, of course, is that we now need to go into where we start actually exchanging mutually binding documents.
Okay, that's what I was looking for.
That is what you were looking for.
Yes.
Yep, that's it. So the idea of mutually binding documents, right, are things exactly like you find out about, right? This is where you go into the legal documents that are actually in place to ensure that now you're actually going to negotiate work to be done for the price to be done, okay? In other words, it's an exchange of goods and services, okay? And it has to, again, be mutually binding and legally binding a lot of times in this particular point when you start to do this. Now, a lot of times when you do this, contracts never are like, all right, here's a contract, just sign it. Love for it to be that way, okay? There's usually negotiations, you know, like, all right, so here's what we're going to do, here's everything that's going to end up happening here. So normally what happens, first of all, is one of these, okay? So if we take a look at my screen here, is what we call a statement of work, okay? The idea of a statement of work. Now, when you start taking a look here, this is pretty much the first step. When everything is done, you're actually willing now to describe what the process is and how you're going to actually procure things that you need to. You need to make sure that you have all the goods and services that you need from that particular supplier. And even at this point, you may go ahead and be able to say, hey, let's make sure that you understand what's out there and what what's available. Okay. Now, when that happens, you may actually at that point go, all right, now that we're at this process where we're talking very well, I'm understanding what you actually want here. Then there's two things, right? You can immediately go to a contract, which if everything is good, you sign it and you're off and ready to go. But if you're not sure because the legal language is confusing you, my best advice is do not sign a contract if any of the language is confusing to you or your lawyers, okay? So make sure you actually do have legal teams on hand to do this if it's something like that. But what you can do is submit what you call a letter of intent instead, okay? A letter of intent is essentially a temporary measure until those particular details on the contract are actually put into place. But it should never be considered a substitute for a contract itself. So have you ever dealt with a letter of intent, Cherokee?
Personally, yes, whenever just applying for jobs, but that's the extent there.
No, that works, okay? That's actually a great example of what we're talking about. Letter of intent is that you said what? I'm intending to come and work for you, okay? So, but even at that point, it doesn't mean that Cherokee can't say, you know what? After a few days, even though I signed that letter of intent that I was going to do so and my true intention is to do so, you might get a better offer, okay?
It happens.
And it does happen. It's never happened to me, but so Cherokee's like, yeah, that happens all the time.
Well, I see online on social media, recruiters are always complaining about how they put all this effort to a new hire, but then they make the travel arrangements and for the interview process, and then at the last minute they just go ahead and cancel. So I know it happens. I see people complaining about it all the time.
And hopefully the letter of intent really does stop someone from doing that, but it doesn't, okay? Even though a letter of intent absolutely is saying that this is your best and most goodwill, that you are intending to do what you're going to end up signing anyways in the contract, you can't substitute it for a contract. So one of the most famous cases in terms of the project management is an incredibly long name. The trustees of Ampleforth Abbey Trust versus Turner and Townsend Project Management. And if you go,
what was that?
Yeah, exactly. If you go, and I understand, okay? Now you're probably like saying, well, why is that important at this point? Well, this actually is a case in which all of a sudden here, this was a building project that ended up happening. The project manager said, of course, I will go ahead and manage the actual project the way that, that's supposed to be managed according to the letter of intent. But they didn't go forward in terms of getting a contract, okay? So then when the people that owned the building, okay, or that did this or developed the property, they said, yeah, we're not going to pay you for something. Well, they went forward and said, look, we've done some of the work, we've already done that, and a judge essentially said, look,
yeah, if you've ever seen Judge Judy, if you don't have it in black and white, it didn't happen or it doesn't matter. She's pretty strict about that.
Yeah, in this one, it's strange. You did all the work. You were essentially saying that this became your contract. And so even though it was just a letter of intent, right?
You want to look out for yourself.
Yeah, you want to look out for yourself, and so that's why you never treat it. So even though they were the ones that were wronged, the judge came back and said, well, you were wrong for not getting a contract.
Exactly.
So you still have to fulfill out that contract regardless of whether they paid you the way that you wanted to or not. You said you were going to do it, and they essentially said you created an ad hoc contract, and that's what happened. And so if you go on to project management and you start typing in letter of intent, you'll normally see that case that I was talking about
So
listed.
that's why you need something that's legally binding, like that statement of work. So
Mm-hmm.
also, Ronnie, I had a question for you. Let's say we agreed on X amount of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Would that statement of work, I've seen it before where a statement of work should really be specific to individual projects. And then if I had a cumulative, I would go ahead and have an additional document such as like a master service agreement or something like that.
Yep, that is correct. Excellent. There we
Yay!
go. So yeah, it does. This should be, the statement of work should be detailed, specific to what we actually want it to be, and then we start working, and hopefully everything ends up being what we call a contract at some point. Now, let's take a look at my screen here. We're not going to fill out a contract, I guarantee you. But normally that's what you have at the top here. It says contract, and this is one that I pulled up just from an internet search, so you can probably find the same one if you choose to. But it normally is all in legal language, and that's why we're not going into it, right? But there's the key part right there, okay? Signing. So here it is. When you actually have something like this, you want to make sure that you understand what's actually being signed and that everything is actually going to be legal, and then all of the details are essentially spelled out from that point on. And you better believe it should be spelled out to the letter here in terms of the contract itself. So this is the legally binding part. So even though a lot of times your letter of intent doesn't signal the idea that there's something legally binding, it does signal your intent that you believe that this relationship is going to work out and it's going to do that. But at the same time, you need to protect yourself by insisting or by making sure that the contract is moving forward. Because if you start work while you have the letter of intent, well, remember that somebody, if you're actually going to go before a judge on doing this, they may decide, well, you treated the letter of intent as a legal contract, so shame on you for not actually getting the contract, and you'll see that. Make sure you push forward here and get that idea of the contract. Now, the other thing that you can do instead, before every contract is signed, is that, along with the letter of intent, is that you can work with what they call a MOU or a MOU. I always call it a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. Okay? This particular type of document, even though in CompTIA they call it a mutually binding document, it is an agreement between two parties, but it's not actually legally binding. Okay? So
a little more formal than a handshake, but not something you could go and take to court. That's what I always was told.
Yeah, that's actually a very good description there. Yeah, it's a mutually beneficial agreement between two partners saying, hey, I'm willing to work together and see how this actually works out. So here's what we're going to negotiate. Even a little bit of payment might be done. And then you go, if this works out, yeah, let's move on to actually sealing it with a contract of some sort. So you may see that as well. Okay? Now, there's also, of course, in this day and age, the idea of service level agreements. Okay? Service level agreements are hopefully designed to help you to spell out the rights and obligations that happen inside of that contract. Okay? What is the expected service level that you are actually both agreeing to do? So if you buy something such as a service contract, what you're hoping for is that they do carry out everything that they say that they're going to carry out, especially when you have issues. Most of us tend to not think about it if we're not really using the product overall, but if you are, you want to make sure that you have that service level agreement here that says and spells out, this is what was promised, make sure it's actually handled.
Yeah, I don't know why. I always think of SLAs as kind of like a teeter-totter of legal documents because it defines both ends of the spectrum there. It says, hey, look, this is what I expect out of you, and this is what I expect from you. And if you don't do that, then this is the consequence. And you really have to take a look at those if you are concerned because, for instance, I just looked at one the other day online for my internet service provider, and it clearly states in their SLA, look, you are not allowed to sue us, okay?
There you go.
You have to go through arbitration. If you have any kind of dispute, it has to be handled in that manner first. So, I mean, that's just one of the clauses, and they could put anything that they want in there, so that's why it's important to really check those out before you enter that agreement.
Yeah, no doubt that this is probably one of the things which really can get, especially in the middle of a contract, right? where what you're expecting to be done and what actually is done is going to be based off of the service level agreement, okay? So if you don't take a quick peek at it, at least, if you don't actually take a detailed look at it, don't be surprised if it's not done. So this is where it becomes binding. Service level agreements are pretty much a key that lets you know that everything that was promised, it should actually be delivered on as well. We also want to talk about purchase orders just briefly, okay? The idea of actually using a purchase order essentially describes the terms in which we're actually willing now to release the amount of money that's been agreed upon for whatever service or product that we've actually gotten. So it's like signing a check, but a purchase order is actually saying, yes, let's go ahead and release that money.
It's the paperwork that helps keep accounting and everyone on the same page and all that money accounted for, right?
Yeah, it really does help. The one time in which paperwork really is essential is going to be right here when somebody says, I didn't get paid, and somebody in your project's now mad and upset and says, well, let's show me the copy of the purchase order, and now they're like, oh, was I supposed to do that? Yes, okay. So the reason why your vendor didn't get paid, you didn't submit a purchase order, okay? Very easy. Those steps are actually there for accountability more than anything else. So remember that this could actually be where you say, hey, I'm willing to pay $1,000 for 500 of these, okay, whatever it might be. Or you might say something like this in terms of a purchase order, we're willing to pay, $50 an hour for the first 100 hours of work that you provide for us, but after that it has to be renegotiated, or it goes up or it goes down, depending on what you need here. But all that has to, again, be accounted for, and that's where a purchase order also steps into, okay? Lastly, we also need to talk about the idea of warranties, okay? Now, Cherokee, do you know the difference between a warranty and a guarantee by chance? It's kind of weird. It's a weird term.
I would say that a warranty is going to be limited by some time frame, and a guarantee would be if you were satisfied with the end result or not.
I think that's a very good idea of a definition of what we're talking about here. Yeah, the idea of satisfaction and what your product is actually going to say that it can do normally is the idea of a guarantee. Like, I promise you, or I guarantee you that it will work the first time, you actually turn it on. So let's take the idea of old lawnmowers, right? Somebody always says something like this, right? First time, every time. Great when you pull on the rip cord for the lawnmower. And so, you're going, come on, I've owned lawnmowers before. And then the first time you're like, wow, that works. That's great.
I've never had to work on the first pull.
And so, so that would be an incredible guarantee. Wouldn't you think that would be an incredible guarantee?
I'd buy it.
Yeah, you'd buy it. And so that is a guarantee, right? It's a promise that it's going to work the first time, every time, okay? Now, a warranty, though, normally does state that, hey, not that it's going to work the first time, every time, but it really is kind of the opposite in terms of mechanical details in this way, okay? If it doesn't actually work the first time, every time, then the company says what it will do to what? To essentially try to compensate for that, okay? Either bring you a new lawnmower or repair that particular part or whatever it might be. A lot of times it has to do with things like small motors, but they're normally guaranteed for the time period like Cherokee was saying here, okay? So like for the first 3 years, it should operate first time, every time, every time you pull it. That's what it should do. And then, of course, they'll list out like, as long as you're not doing it while submerged into water, as long as you're not doing this, when you're trying to, tow this behind your truck.
Especially for electronics with the no water.
Oh yeah,
residue
yeah, that's something. Yeah, and you start seeing that too. Is it's like, well, this thing's under warranty, and then you read in the warranty, it's like, unless there's moisture damage or water damage, and so that's when you start seeing the limitations there. But all these are again set in place to really provide for your project the legally binding information. A lot of times, if not mutually binding information, that you can count on when working with a company. That, that one, you're not administratively responsible for or legally responsible for, but now you actually have, you work into an agreement with it so that your company and their company mutually benefits. So do take a look at these documents and make sure you actually have an understanding of them, especially before you go into the exam.
Yeah, thanks for showing us those tools and documents, Ronnie. I think you guys at home should be pretty familiar. We've looked at some of the most basic, common forms. So if not, go back and rewatch the episode. But I think that's going to wrap it up for this particular episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm Cherokee Boos.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off for IT Pro TV.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.